I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Steven Sheehi, Professor of Middle East Studies and Arab Studies at the College of William and Mary. He's also the founding faculty director of the Decolonizing Humanities Project, which seeks to validate, elevate, and learn from knowledge practices and creative expressions of communities of color, natives, and displaced peoples and marginalized identities. His work examines cultural, intellectual, art history, and the political economy of the Middle East, with a special emphasis on the late Ottoman Empire and the Arab Renaissance. His research and written commentaries have also examined photography, psychoanalysis, minorities in the Middle East, Islamophobia in the United States, and contemporary issues of the Middle East and North America. His 3 books include Foundations of Modern Arab Identity, Islamophobia, the Ideological Campaign Against Muslims, and the Arab Imago, a social history of Indigenous photography from 1860 to 1910. His website is stevensheehi.com. That's STEPHENSHEEHI.com. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Published by Trapart Books, 2019, and also available as an ebook through iBooks and Kindle. For more information, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You may also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and the podcast website, renderingunconscious.org. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
The conference may not be coming up next week.
Right, because of the coronavirus thing?
A lot of us done all this work, so I kind of, I'm not, she's the one who does all the real hard work, and I'm just, I'm the support team.
You're the arm candy.
I'm the arm candy, yes. I'm the trophy husband. And you know what? In all honesty, I am more than honored to be the trophy husband of her.
It's a good place to be. No, she's really brilliant, and that's what I told her. Like, the whole time that we were talking, all I kept thinking is, like, this is the future. This is the future. This is the future. It's like, it's the future.
Well, 2 things. Number one is I was really intimidated to talk to you while being recorded, because with the same name as her, I mean, she puts the bar so damn high, I'm just a bumbling fool next to her, so I'm kind of like, oh man, this is gonna. I guess I just make it look that much better, maybe, I don't know. But and secondly, I mean, about her being the future. The Division 39 conference next week. She and 2 other women of color organize this, and it really does give a framework of really the state of the field. where it's going. I mean, it's different to the work that's been done. So sort of more traditional work is actually still there. She's included, evidence-based stuff and research, that everyone accuses, psychoanalysis of not having. That's there. She's talking about social issues in very real ways, like autism panels, and then she's doing more, including more cutting-edge stuff about race, gender, sexuality, and it really is, I think, representative of all that psychoanalysis can offer, rather than us, talking about how retrograde it can actually be at times, So it really is exciting, and I think a lot of people are really, really, really excited about it, and that's all that's coming out. And even I think the whole tension within psychoanalysis is miscast as a generational tension. I really do. I think a generational tension is a guise for ideological privilege. Because there's a lot of folks who have been around and doing this for ages and punching it out and doing the work that we love for ages, and they're, in their 70s, and they're as turned on as the people who are in their 20s and 30s, So I think, and that has to do with people like Lara, people like, Nadine Obaid and Layla Crane Salvo, who are, Salvo Crane, who, really put their heart into it, It
really shows.
Yeah, I mean, this is what inclusivity looks like, shows what dynamism looks like, But it also shows what deference looks like, So, yeah, it was really, and that has also to do with her really incredible, the team that she gathered around her, and that those three gathered around them. Their organizing committee, I don't know what it's called, is just really, really, really amazing. So,
no, it must be. I'm excited about it because, I told her that I've never flown in or flown anywhere for a Division 39 conference. The only ones I've been to were when they were in New York and I was in New York, and it was convenient, oh yeah, I'll go there on the weekend, Right. But then I saw what she was doing, and I was like, oh, yeah, I need to go to this. I need to be a part of this. Carl was actually going to be filming a movie in Greece during that time, and I was like, can we do that in April so I can go to this? Yeah.
Wow, that's a big sacrifice. It's worth it. I mean, I think this one is worth it.
It's game-changing.
It really is, and I think, again, at one level, I think it really does reflect the state of the field of where we are and what we could be doing, but also, she and Leilani and Nadine were very also mindful. I mean, they have, the Lenape opening up with land acknowledgements, and I mean, there's just a lot of sort of really thoughtful organizing that went into this. I mean, if you look at you've seen the program itself. Just aesthetically, it kind of just is, very striking. Not filled with a lot of, silly pastels and, confetti, right? Which, I mean, aesthetically, for someone who does art, aesthetically that speaks to a particular sort of aesthetic, right?
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, no, the work on this is amazing.
I mean, pastels are like to me, like the
elementary school.
And I don't know, it's the cowardice of not choosing an actual color, and also of actually avoiding the line, right? The line which has to be a black line, right, and a black and white line, right? So aesthetically, those previous the artwork and posters have been representative of a certain form of, let's call it, psychoanalytic aesthetic. So yeah, it's really, I'm excited about it.
You're chairing a panel?
I am. I'm chairing a panel. It's called, it was called Beirut, Palestine, and I think now it's called Palestine in Beirut. And it's a number of younger students and clinicians who I believe are either Lebanese or Palestinian born and raised in Lebanon, and thinking about their positionality to Zionism, to Israel, to Arabness, to their relationship, their racial relationship in the United States, how their Arabness and how Zionism and how the Palestinian cause mediates that relationship, and of course how that also is contextualized within their own training and their own practice. So I'm really excited about it. That's another thing is I get to do the easy work, sit
Moderating.
around.
That
Yeah.
sounds really interesting, though. What's the training like in Lebanon?
In Lebanon, I'm not super familiar. I mean, that's something, so, I'm not an analyst or even a psychologist. I'm just a humble,
Professor.
humble country professor, teaching, I have the same trajectory as most people my age, which, I come through the cultural studies revolution, in college in the 80s and grad school in the 90s, so we were all, lit up about post-structuralism and the way it meets Marxism and psychoanalysis. So, for a long time, I think, as you probably well know, Lacanianism was really, the bastion of the academy and a bastion of cultural studies people and comp lit people, and that's kind of how I came into it. So I really don't do clinical stuff, and that's my work in Lebanon. I mean, in Palestine, I don't really work in Lebanon that much in terms of psychoanalysis and other things I do though. But so we're working on that, how training works there. But that's actually more Lara's bailiwick than mine. Again, this is great because we get to do all these things. I sort of sit down and I'm learning all the sort of the nuts and bolts. And I don't want to say I've moved away from Lacan, but I've also been able to sort of contextualize Lacan a lot better because we're not really taught that in grad school, right? It's a really kind of silly sectarianism that we are taught in grad school, right? You have Freud and Lacan, and then you sort of mock everybody else out. But then when you actually read Lacan thoroughly, you understand that he is engaging not only Freud, but also, Klein and, whomever else, right? So this is not to say that he seriously does not depart from them, but you tend to then approach others, Klein or whomever else, in a less sectarian manner, So that's part of been my learning process. And I credit that, again, to having a really healthy relationship with someone who's way smarter than me and who's involved in that formalistic training, So yeah,
But you're a professor of cultural studies of the Middle East, yeah?
Yeah. So I mean So I started off with my PhD is in it's called Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. And I was an undergrad in sort of anthropology and liberal arts and the whole theory jockey, back in the day, thinking about simulacras and Lacan and Marx and all these sorts of things. And my dissertation and my first book is thinking about the formation of modern Arab subjectivity in the 19th and early 20th century. And what I did is I looked at a bunch of sort of what we would call pulp fiction, but also political tracts and biographies, autobiographies, and articles and commentaries, and just try to think about the ways in which Arab identity, modern Arab identity, was articulated or being articulated in the moment of the emergence of modernity in the Arab world. And of course, the colonial encounter was essential to this. But it was always that kind of thing about finding it, this is not something that's imposed, but on the other hand, there's this really complex dialectic, and that this is where Lacan helped me think through the formation of Arab subjectivity within a sort of Kojevian, sort of Hegelian dialectic that was going on, that for me uncovered how modern Arab subjectivity, as it was being articulated in the era of nationalisms, is one that can only find itself lacking in relation to a master logos of European progress. So you can see that where I think my work was kind of the first that really thought about the 19th and the early 20th century, and in fact, actually, I think Arabic literature in general, within Lacanian terms. So yeah, I mean, it works really well. I mean, I'm still quite fond of it. I think you always have a special relationship to your first book, right? So, and it was impactful, I think, in the field. I'm very fortunate about that. But that's where that's my sort of old world of thinking about, of having psychoanalysis help me think about Arab subjectivity and how it impacts sort of formal processes of ego formation. So yeah, I mean, that's the, I don't know if that answer or that tells you anything, but
it makes sense. Like, it makes a lot of sense and is super interesting.
thanks. Yeah, like I have to say, I think I look back, and not to be immodest, I look back, and I finished my dissertation in 1998, and my book was published in 2004. It's called Introduction to Modern Arab Subjectivity. Actually, the foundation of modern Arab subjectivity. It was actually initially called, the dissertation is called Epistemography of Modern Arab Subjectivity, because I also want to think about issues of epistemology, and the epistemology of modernity, and the epistemology of subject formation itself in the modern era, right? 20 years later, for the past 5-6 years, I've been really immersing myself in what's called decolonial theory, and I really was reassured or validated that, I was doing this work in the 1990s, and subsequently, thinking about how we are all saturated by what's called the coloniality of modernity, right? The coloniality of an epistemology that sort of arranges a certain subjectivity in normative ways, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it was a good way to start my journey, I think. That's been consistent, and I think it emerges in a number of my projects and one of my books subsequently. I have these different books that seem like they're not connected, but I think they all speak to some degree about the coloniality of Arab modernity.
And what are your other books?
Beg your pardon?
What are your other books?
My other books are, one which is Islamophobia, and I particularly take a interest of Islamophobia in the United States as an ideological formation that is mobilized for U.S. power. But then my last book was called Arab Imago, about it's the first book on indigenous Arab photography, or indigenous photography of the Arab world. They weren't all Arabs, some were Armenians and Assyrians and other minorities in the Middle East, from 1860 to 1910. And there too, I think here you can see, I'm just thinking about the epistemology of modernity and how it constructs the ways in which literally we see, right? How do you receive and how do you construct an image, and how is that image seen as natural? And then I think also about how do we read images, and that how do images function within a time of severe social transformation. And my argument was that images are actually sort of I kind of reach into Mahler for that. They sort of provide some sort of object consistency or whatever, some object coherence in this time. It gives us something to latch onto. But on the other hand, if I also have I ask us to read both manifest and latent context of an image, right? Which the manifest actually tells us about us, sort of stabilizes the way we see, the way we have social relations, the way we interact with one another, our intersubjectivity, maybe we can say in psychoanalysis. But also the latent is that which actually constructs and gives meaning by also being excluded. So you'll have images of, sort of respectable middle class, but also what has been locked out, what is trying to be forgotten, what is that threatens that in the Middle East, that has to be pushed to the margins to make sense of the stability, if that makes, if that is coherent. So. Yeah, so that's my second book on photographic portraiture, really. I spend, 200 pages looking at carte de visite.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I like it. It's a good. It was a. That was we were talking earlier, you and I, about the how long projects take, and that one was something that comes out of 20 years interest in visual culture and never having the courage to sort of write about it until I was able to punch the ticket. Oh, I had to write this other book first, these other articles first, to be able to have sort of, I feel, legitimacy to move into the visual. And you yourself sort of commute between the visual and theoretical, so I don't know if you feel that as well.
Yeah, it makes sense because, the things I'm writing about now are things I've been interested in for 20 years,
Right,
but I never even considered that they would ever be something I would write about, especially like psychoanalytically or like tell my colleagues about, 20 years
right,
ago.
right, right.
But yeah, now it's at least one book.
But I think that also speaks to authority, right? And like I know, for example, so I have my degree in Near Eastern Studies, because I have it in what was previously called Oriental Studies, right? Because myself, I am a brown man in American academics. I think what happens is that we're put in particular corrals that we're not allowed out of. If you're, in other words, if you're a specialist on, let's say, Arabic literature, you're not qualified to ever talk really about English literature. However, if you're Frederick Jameson, you can talk about Chinese literature. You can talk about anything you want, right? So that is why I think I felt that I didn't have the credibility, the legitimacy to go into the visual before I was able to sort of establish myself and within a cultural studies milieu. Also, I was able to establish some sort of, theoretical bona fides, which allowed you then to commute. It's not the purview of people who do area studies, let alone, Middle Eastern studies, East Asian studies, South Asian studies, African studies, Latin America. It's not we don't have the liberty in many ways to commute, to think about, other disciplines as if you did anthropology. I mean, if you look at anthropologists, people they write their first book on anthropology, and they do their first book on Micronesia, and the next book that they're doing is they're in the Maquiladoras projects in Mexico. Which, God bless them. I'm not throwing shade on that. I'm just saying that that's a particular privilege that they have when they're not because the academy itself is racialized. That's what Orientalism does, right? And I think that's what you're also to some degree experiencing. Oh, okay, as a psychologist, psychoanalyst, who am I to talk about art, right? That's the purview of art historians, right?
Yeah, and when I presented this, actually, I won't name where, but recently,
Right.
one group was like, I don't understand, which theory are you applying to which period of art history? And I'm like, no, I'm tracing this like line of different artists from like the past 150 years that aren't really related to each other in anybody else's mind, I don't think. I'm just noticing this thread. And they're like, well, which psychoanalytic theory are you using? And I'm like, well, I'm using Lacan and Laplanche and Winnicott. And they were just like, what?
They're also
I'm
they're
like,
also
I'm
not
using my ideas from after I read all this other psychoanalytic theory for the past 25 years.
right, right. And God bless art history, but it's tough, because I've presented a few times in art history milieus, and there's some really great work being done there, but there's also again some really really high disciplinary walls. And I know that, for example, one of, for example, for the book, one of my reviewers came back and generally gave me a good review, but made comments about sort of course, can we talk about photography in the Middle East without talking about, you know, European photographers? Can we talk about without, these sorts of things, and sort of telling, it's really amazing. Um, people say, well, you clearly haven't read such and such and such and such. You're right. I didn't, because I really don't really care about the carte de visite in Paris, which of course I had to become responsible for knowing because of that. But of course, when you're writing about the carte de visite in Paris, you don't necessarily have to really be responsible for anything else. And that you might put as a footnote that this person went to the Middle East, their first photo excursion was actually to the Middle East. That's a footnote to you. And then you could talk about, and that gives you license to talk about Orientalist photography as much as you want. But that's what disciplinary boundaries do. I think it's getting a little bit better, which is nice. I think it's got better over the past 20 years, but still, it's tough commuting. And I think for someone who has been sort of ghettoized into because of I do area studies in general. You really have to have built a currency to give yourself authority to do that, when that's not necessarily other people have license to do that. And again, maybe they should, because maybe it's good work. I'm not saying, I'm not belittling that, but I think it's
these are it's pretty infuriating that everybody always has to refer back to the same people from the same places for like all of time.
Right. But what that does is, I mean, that reproduces two things, right? It reproduces structures of power and disciplinary mechanisms, as we were saying, that enforce who can talk and who can't talk, right? So, for example, if Jane Smith said the exact same thing as you, but she had an art history degree from Northwestern and was teaching at whatever school, then she may be given license to do that. So it's not coincidental. And then of course it is precisely about this sort of discursive possibilities, right? I mean, I was told, even when I was doing theory in the 90s, when no one in Middle Eastern studies was doing theory, I was told literally, you're like this in metaphor because it's an art history one or a modernist one, which is, Picasso had to be able to draw his bull first before he then drew his, Cubist bull, which I'm thinking, no, dude, that's actually kind of not that's exactly the opposite of the point. You have to have you literally have to write, you have to produce academic trash, paintings to then become a modernist. No.
I'm so tired of that argument.
Yeah, but it's deployed for very precise ideological reasons, and it has very precise ideological effects. But we still punch through.
Talk about decolonial humanities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that really, I mean, what we're talking about speaks to the way the academy is structured in general. And, it's not like the man sitting on, pulling levers in the 150th floor of, the Freedom Tower in New York City, the Trilateral Committee, controlling the academy. It's the weight and structure of academy that was built over the past 200 years, right? Mm-hmm. So, Decolonizing Humanities is a project that I started at William and Mary, partially because there's some synergy on the ground between some colleagues, but also there's just a need for us to think about structures of how we approach humanities, but also how that approach produces us, right? It's not only my way of like, hey, let's rethink about how this is being taught, but how the way that it's being taught has produced us and the structure itself. And to define decolonizing humanities is really hard because there's a sort of an inside and an outside, right? There's a structural level and then there's a pedagogical level, like how do we actually teach, right? And so I think just for us, it was the two centered issues of a race, which is being done in other, doesn't have to be called decolonizing humanities for that, but also, for example, in the United States, it's incredibly important for us to center issues of indigeneity, to think about our relationship in higher education to the settler colonial society in which we live, to think about the ways in which our institution and our pedagogy, no matter how self-aware, also reproduces cis heteropatriarchy, produces hegemony of white supremacy, even if you're trying to think about issues of race, right? So just because you think about issues of race doesn't mean you're really, really thinking about white supremacy. What does that actually mean? So decolonizing humanities actually, I think, at this point, when Mary is just trying to think about a relationship between what we do, just like whiteness is a relationship, right? Whiteness is not a thing, right? Like I said, it's not the man, right? I mean, even though I love the man, I love that metaphor, and I think we should use it. But I mean, it's just not like, it's not the three people that Bernie talks about who controls 50% of the wealth in the United States. Like, that's a problem. We know that's a problem. But if we take those three people away and redistribute their 50% of the wealth, that's not going to necessarily dismantle white supremacy, right? Not to say that their wealth is not built and facilitated by it, but so it's also just thinking about our whiteness as a social relation, and so how does that affect our relationship to teaching the humanities? Right? What constitutes humanities? What constitutes something that we should be teaching or not? So yeah, I mean it's a big project. We've been doing it for about 2 years here, and we're still stumbling around.
No, that's great. The humanities has kept psychoanalysis alive a lot better than psychology has.
Absolutely.
And I made sure to include a section in the book I just finished about lay analysis and how important it is, because I have a PsyD, a doctorate in psychology, and I didn't even hear of Lacan until I moved to New York. I was already 30 years old, and
right.
I read literally one paper by Freud in grad school.
Right.
It's just gone.
Right. Well, I think obviously, I mean, this is a cliche, but it's unfortunately, or maybe not fortunately, it's absolutely true. Which is, I mean, if you read Lacan, if you read Freud, I mean, they're humanists. Freud's most popular theoretical idiom, the Oedipal complex, comes out of the humanities, right? Comes out of Greek literature. The Purloined Letter, which I think is actually one of Lacan's best pieces. It comes out of literature. I mean, they all talk about James. They all talk, it's incredibly important for us, and I think that's why it's a little bit shocking sometimes for me to come into psychoanalytic spaces and still hear these sorts of discussions of social versus individual. It seems so retrograde, and I understand where that comes from. Again, ideologically, we understand where that comes from. We understand how psychoanalysis has been depoliticized and how it's always actually fought its own impetus to be apolitical. I mean, we blame it on the American school, which we perhaps rightfully should, but it was quite alive, I think, also in Europe, even during Freud's time. I think Freud himself struggled with understanding psychoanalysis politically or deploying it politically. I mean, he had these sort of two faces. I think sometimes it was quite, when he talked about Zionism, and he wasn't a Zionist, he was an anti-Zionist in as much as he didn't believe in Zionism. I mean, if you read his letter to folks who were trying to convince him otherwise, it was a very sort of psychoanalytic reading of Zionism. So this is not to understand that he can't. I mean, I think that's for the basis of what would happen in social psychoanalysis, which took over the next 20, 30 years, which is incredibly political. But I think he himself also, as a Jew who wants to kind of keep his head down, was also so afraid to make it too political, unlike some of his followers, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it was a shock to me to find out this battle is still going on within psychoanalysis is sort of finding like the border between where the ego starts and the social begins. You know, it's like,
I was taught in psychoanalytic training, they told us we could not comment on any public figure. We could not talk about politics psychoanalytically. Like, it was just like, you're not allowed to do it. I don't know who said that, but that's what we were taught. Like, you're just not allowed to do it. It's something that's not done.
It's crazy. Yeah, that's so crazy. I mean, it's funny because I think there's a problem. I mean, what happened to psychoanalysis, at least from my very sort of distant perspective, is that what happened in the years or the decades after psychoanalysis is that one level it was becoming depoliticized. On the level of the left, or not even left, but even the right, I think what happened is that psychoanalysis was used to psychoanalyze social phenomenon, right? Which in many cases was retrograde, and especially is used, and to decades later still used in in terms of a racist racial agenda, intentional or not unintentional racial agenda, right? Psychoanalyzing Islam, psychoanalyzing the Arab mind, psychoanalyzing, right, all that sort of stuff. And so I think at one level, psychoanalysis really hasn't gotten around its own culpability and how you kind of forgive the language, how they kind of fucked it up. Because actually the leftists were really great at first, but what happened is it became social psychoanalysis, which is great at one level, but it's also completely vacating it's on the other, right? On the other level, because of that, I think they were afraid to say, okay, let's leave the social out. Which is like, there's a difference between importing the social in and then exporting social psychoanalytic theory out. So I think there was a blur, which is what happened. So, but the fact of obviously for you to walk into a space and to not be able to use, which when I was in therapy, my analysts did that, which actually made things a lot more legible. Right, he was very agile in bringing in a large number of cultural references. He was very erudite, and I think he knew he was talking to a college professor. So I think he was able to bring from pop, pop culture to and music to classical references. So that actually, to not let that happen is absurd, right? But there are limitations, I think, also of psychoanalysis within the academy itself, and that's where I feel that being introduced through the current book that I'm writing with Lara on Palestine, but also being introduced into, I've been presenting at Division 30. I presented for the first time at Division 39 last year, and hanging out more with clinicians allows me also to step out of what I feel, as I told you, I feel as a limited sectarianism, a very limiting sectarianism of the academy, how we approach other schools and thoughts, how not to think synthetically, which I think I think my work has got a lot more sophisticated in terms of psychoanalytic theory when I'm able to sort of expand out, right? I mean, like Winnicott, come on, who in the 90s was talking about Winnicott in the academy? Nobody, right? Now it's sort of coming in, so
it'll be great to have you in Copenhagen too, because the space is very small. It only holds 65 people, so I think I'm only gonna have 50 people total, so that we have a little room,
right.
And it's like psychoanalysts that are interested in the psychoanalytic community outside of institutional walls. So like some people might be affiliated with institutes, but everyone is also open to exploring networking not within those kinds of hierarchical authoritarian boundaries. And so everybody coming is great, basically, and forward thinking and open-minded, at least to some degree. So that's good. More so than at usual conferences also.
Right. And people bring in their racial baggage and their cultural baggage, and that's stuff that could be worked out. I think it's a mistake to sort of think that we can check that, or a good productive environment allows that. I mean, I don't want to sound like a psychoanalyst because I'm not, or a psychologist because I'm not, but allows that process to actually happen rather than disavow it, which we both have been in psychoanalytic spaces and conferences where that disavowal happens constantly, right? Where there's a like, you're woke, so we don't need to talk about a process that's going on at this time. Right? Just because you're woke doesn't, like, I work through my maleness because I'm woke. I work through my my whiteness because I'm woke, right? So hopefully that space will allow us to do that as well.
For sure.
Right?
You have to talk about what's happening in the room. It's a bunch of psychoanalysts. Right. We see it.
Right. Well, do you?
Hopefully. Some of us do. We'll see.
Exactly. I mean, I was at a conference at one time, which I will not say where, and I had a liberal Zionist want to engage me. And so, as I said, Laura and I are working on this book. It's called Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, and where we are discussing, we're trying to focus on the practice of Palestinian clinicians. And part of this book also, she and I actually published one article, and then I published another article that thinks critically about dialogue initiatives and how dialogue initiatives actually replicate modes of repression and oppression and do not work to remediate the settler colonial condition. And so a lot of liberal Zionists take issue because what they really want to do is they want to connect, right? They want to be acknowledged, and by acknowledging that there is a Palestinian, that there is an indigenous person that you are not, right? And I had this conversation, and the more I pushed up at, this is the process, and speaks to the issue of being the process in the room. This guy's a psychoanalyst, not me, by the way. And I frustrated him so much because I'm arguing for the politics of refusal. That it is an essential mental health imperative to some degree that Palestinians at this point refuse dialogue, because the refusal of their dialogue is actually, but acceptance of dialogue is really actually a refusal of their own subjectivity. And this it was not able to be metabolized by this person in any possible way. He was getting so frustrated. At one point, he yelled at me that by the way, I'm Lebanese, I'm not Palestinian, but the Palestinians are not ready for dialogue, because you have to deal literally with I think what he said, something like, you have to deal with, not oppressing women, and you have to deal with all the shit in your retrograde shit, backward shit in your society before you can come to the table. And this is in a psychoanalytic conference. By the way, no one in that room called him out. No one in that, this was a progressive room, right? Talking, in fact, arranged around issues of coloniality, shall we say, and no one in that room called him out. And that's the process in the room where psychoanalysts at times tend to check that awareness at the door. But that's what, that's why.
No, it's absolutely true. That needs to be brought up and addressed right then and there. If people come to the table on somebody else's terms, they've already lost.
Well, that's exactly right. This goes back to my first book about, the Hegelian dialogue, is right when you say yes. Right? This is, of course, and this is Althusser, right, about hailing and interpolation. People forget what the metaphor is. The metaphor is that if a cop hails you and you say yes, you have now entered into that sort of dialectic by which you are being acknowledged and recognized and become subjectified, right? And exactly, and I think what Indigenous scholars are showing us especially those from North America, Turtle Island, and what is now known as New Zealand and Australia, is they are showing us the importance of the right to refuse, right? And that is, this is not pedantic. And they also show us the imperative to refuse. So going just back to psychoanalysis, it's really funny because I think whether it's in the academy or whether it's in clinicians, there's a still resistance to understand how psychoanalysis provides us with certain tools. But on the other hand, we refuse to use those tools when we're pushed. We can like rip down the walls, but we're not going to rip down the struts and the beams that hold up that structure, right? So again, I mean, the fact that that person who's an analyst said this stuff and was not able to realize it, and he'll call it an enactment. It's not an enactment, you asshole. You're a freaking ass, you know, and couldn't process this idea. You couldn't process someone saying no to you. That's not an enactment. It's an enactment of what would happen if I were to do this, which is why a settler colonial state like Israel might then go punish the Palestinians, right? That's what's an enactment of, if nothing else, right? So yeah, I mean, I think I look forward to Copenhagen because I think people are, hopefully we could those issues will come up, and hopefully people can, you know, attend to the process, as they say.
We have at least 3 political panels.
That's great. That's great. That's really exciting. Yeah. No, I'm really excited to be in the room. You know, these are, you know, I do feel that I'm still a student, you know.
But we should all be.
Yeah, well, you know, you're again, you know, you've moved into, you know, dealing with art, and I think for us to think about, for example, how art is produced is important of just rather reading representation, right? Because, you know, coming out of the 90s, everybody, for example, was doing like film. Everyone's a film studies person. You do you're going to write an article at some point on film, right? And people who were doing film studies were kind of getting pissed off because, you know, it is about, there are sort of technical things that really inform how art is being constructed. So when we talk about formalism and when I sort of think about formalism in a critical way, we also want to understand, like, what is it producing and how does it produce through that process of you know, technique, right? So for me, coming from, I'm still learning that, which is so exciting, like to see how technically psychoanalysis thinks through certain things, not theoretically, technically, you know. I think it's made my work a lot more rich, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, especially if you've been through analysis, I mean, that's really where you learn everything, you know, is seeing it at play in your own life. Right. And then you can help other people see it at play in their lives and read about it and be like, oh, is that what so-and-so called that? I see what they're saying, you know. Right. But you have to see it at play in your own life.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, so yeah, we were in Palestine, and yes, you know, I'm working. So we do a lot of sort of participatory research too, because part of our commitment Lara and I made, especially with the beginning of this project, was that what we don't want to do is have this piece be extractive in any way, right? It's very easy, and it's so often, especially in the case with like Palestine, Palestine suffer tourism, suffer research, right? I forgot what Eve Tuck called it, or something like damage research, right? You look at the damage, and see how hard people are suffering, and then kind of leave, right? And it's really extractive, you know. So we've gone to Palestine, we've gone to places in the West Bank, in Bethlehem, Ramallah, East Jerusalem, and also within the 1948 boundaries of the state now known as Israel. And to see how people are actually practicing, and in the process also how they think through their practice. And also to see psychoanalysis, the tension of psychoanalysis as a practice, the practicalities of it and the training, but also to see how it kind of falls apart sometimes, you know. to see how it enlists even Palestinian. I mean, those issues of coloniality enlist Palestinian clinicians themselves because you're trained in it, right? To see their learning process. Yeah, it's been exciting. I'm
It's
sure
incredible.
Lara will share that with you all in Copenhagen, no doubt. But yeah, we did a lot of cool things thinking about. For example, so she does the technical stuff, right, and then I sort of do the theoretical stuff. So I did a bit about Fanon in Palestine, and it was such an incredible, moving experience for me, right? And it allowed me to sort of think also by which, have psychoanalysis help me think in ways in which these clinicians are working through stuff, to think about their practice and how they work their practice with their patients. So it's really powerful.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Steven Shi. For more, please visit his website, stevensheehi.com. That's STEPHENSHEEHI.com. You may also visit the Decolonizing Humanities Project at William and Mary. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Published by Trapart Books, 2019, and also available as an ebook through iBooks and Kindle. For more information, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You may also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and the podcast website, renderingunconscious.org. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, Knight of Swords, from the album The Chapel is Empty, a collaboration with Acoustic Timbre Frequency, available from Trapart Editions and Highbrow Lowlife. Knight of Swords. Exhibiting at several of the salons, and his view of art was strong, influenced by, during a period, there were in total 6 of these salons in Paris and Brussels. They presented avant-garde, the rainfall. It amounted to an average and mostly occurred in this season. Scientifically, later installed, water, gauge, record, the world, essaying a psychology of dreams that tries to keep a sense of the underworld always present in our work. With them, this moves backwards, from logos to mythos. This move is the embodiment of a series of opposites. 7 of Swords. To this end, she saw the creative process as the ultimate sacred act, whereby, through emulating the act of creation, humanity could move back towards a reintegration with their divine origin. Artists have been gifted with the talent to create worlds, those works of art that could spark the spiritual evolution she believed between normalcy and the features of straight males. While these correlations may exist, King of Pentacles, as reactions, this is also why the same needs as artificial humans and cold, distinctly non-human behavior. And today, this is what underpins the rationale behind the decision to introduce an attempt to implement an idea of a creative crossroads where the arts become a locus for dialogue, for remaking cultural sense. Our history has yet to be written, and the success or failure of this creative. Draw one more card. The 8 of Cups. The beauty of a work is made from sublimated reality. The mysticism of a work derives from the depiction of the unreal. Laced or hooked in front, which line? Lace frills around the neck. I am wearing eyeshadow and lipstick. I've dreamt deeply and slept heavily. A wild animal never looks so well as when some obstacle of pronounced durability is between us. A personal experience has intensified rather than diminished that idea. After all, however, there is nothing like custom, for neither defining data is highlighting the premise of the movement itself, accentuating its resistance to definition, systemization, and categorization. A resistance reflective of the human unconscious and sexuality, which subvert normalization and classification. Proponents of new ways of thinking about society, and there was still nothing in the mind that was not first in sense. The dream may mean something, yes, but it was basically a rearrangement of day-life residues in accordance with building operations. This was during the time which the young Dalai Lama spent in meditation. 3 years. It was pointed out that worms and insects might easily be killed during the work. Soon after the outbreak of the war, author and poet Hugo Ball came to Zurich with Emmy Hennings. Ball, himself a writer, philosopher, performer, and producer, first established the Cabaret Voltaire as a literary cabaret where he accompanied Hennings on the piano while she performed songs and 3 quests for God, 3 religious modes. You should understand religion in the sense of that which connects the creature to the Creator. Like a shipwreck, we die going into ourselves, as though we were drowning inside our hearts, as though we lived falling out of the skin and into the soul. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Robert Motherwell, the Dada painters and poets, Hans Richter, Dada, art and anti-art,